if I understand what you're saying, that is now possible right through the NSF awards database. And those are the kind of things where we want to improve linkages and operations. Yeah.
It's not automatic the way it works, basically. I mean, if data sets are deposited at us, and I think the Arctic Data Center for the US does this similar. If data sets are kind of deposited with us, we link them to the award. It's like something someone deposits a data set with us is there. And we did for data sets that are not deposited in our repository, we kind of depend on the project PIs to basically provide a link to their data sets, but we catalog all what they provide, and there's a mandate that they have to provide the links basically to us. How much they do it is a different thing, and how complete it is.
Yes. So I think that aligns with our group's goal of improving interoperability, including among observing assets, but also with all at a broader perspective with data and publications. That aspect is pretty much beyond the scope of the group, but I'm not sure I addressed that very well, but to get to another point you had, so this registry is not a comprehensive catalog of observing sites, for example, or of research projects. And there are things that are moving in that direction, such as, for example, Pluridex, with all these field facilities across a variety of programs and networks and information sources. And so it has come up in the past whether or not this group POEG should develop its own, for example, aggregating catalog and this go-to one-stop shop for observing sites. Well, I think that's not really our place for POEG. We don't have the funding. And more importantly, what we're doing with the registry and other aspects of the working group is a very much, I would say, needed stepping stone to improve the level of interoperability, access, and machine readability of the information that's needed by aggregators. Because we are probably a couple decades behind what, for example, is possible with the Polder Federated Search Tool. A decade behind anyway, because a lot of networks don't share structured information, or they don't even track it themselves, or they share it with a custom schema, or with that's a big part of it, or without machine readable access, certainly. So I hope that clarifies that this registry is not meant to be an aggregating catalog of observing assets in itself.
Further questions or comments? Christine?
Can you put the asset types in also the previous slide, Bill, in full screen mode? Because I was wondering about definition for sites.
Yes.
So most of what's in there makes sense to me. Fixed stations, facilities, whatever that is, moorings, observatories. But what plots? I probably need some explanation in order to understand whether a plot is a site.
This is good. This is good. There's a lot of different terms here with overlapping, I'd say, but distinct, often undefined meaning. particularly for sites. If you caught from the presentation, that projects, any organization that tracks projects tends to call them projects. And I could jump into this. Maybe the best way to dig into this is to look at how we came up with the categorization of observing assets. We looked at these 44 portals, at what they self-reported as the concept that they were tracking. So you see down here that it went way to the right, almost, well, for example, the Arctic LCC, due south, Isefik, Met Norway, Ness above, all these that were tracking projects called them simply projects. Very much related, some called them research projects or studies or activities, that kind of thing. So that's where there was like a convergence in usually undefined concepts about what could be called projects. Whereas sites, we clustered together all these different terms as self-reported by catalogs. So do you lump these together is a question. Plots, for example, was what was covered by the Tula Field Station GIS. This gets involved somewhat in terms of distinguishing sensors from platforms. This gets some into what are called stations, but sometimes those stations are different than, for example, field facilities or platforms, or field sites. Interact actually technically calls their observatories and field stations field sites, at least what it seemed to most be. So is it okay to lump all these point locations that could be sensors, platforms, meteorological stations or marine stations, moorings, marine sampling locations, wherever there's been repeat measurements? Is it okay to lump them together as sites? If not, how do we separate them out? And define them? It's thorny, isn't it? It's much more thorny than in the data world, if you will.
But
You understand?
now, some of these make sense to me, but plots is a different thing. So that would be sort of a representation, a graphical representation of.
I think they mean vegetation plots.
There are plots
Oh, like a
also in the-
vegetation plot. I'm sorry.
A quadrant plot that you would sample.
Sorry, I didn't understand that.
No, it's okay.
That was going to go in
yeah.
the same direction. It's just the physical structure nested within a site, and then like in Alter or ITEX networks, they have different types of plots nested within a site. So they would have a warming
Random
treatment
quadrats.
or nutrient addition or whatnot within the site, and they will distinguish the sensors within particular type of plots.
Makes sense for me, then I understand it. So I would need some guidance to reading the
So I would keep
glossary
that
describing
structure
the
as it is.
It sounds like the objection is withdrawn, but we should maybe provide sub-definitions for some of the items included.
Or how about we just change that to vegetation plots or ecosystem plots?
Sure. If you just want to make it so it's a little bit more.
It's not plotting data.
Specific.
No,
Yeah.
yeah, it's different.
And related to that is that facilities, stations, they mean very different things in different contexts. And so and some of these are, it's tricky, but Oh yeah, so this is how we did it, right? So you've seen this before. So projects, for example, almost all of them were conceptually converging. And then, but here's another idea. It has been suggested, one suggestion has been to split out for sites, to split that into two categories, research and monitoring sites and observatories and field stations, where there's actually like a place where scientists can sleep and eat and pull together their logistical supplies and then head out. You know, these things have been called different things, but think in terms of the Interact network of observatories and field stations. Is it worth splitting those out? And if so, how do we do that?
See, for me, I wouldn't have seen the difference between the two of those until you explained that one's manned and one's not.
Yeah, with staff, with housing versus I don't know, a building with instruments on it. I don't know.
I'm not going to speak about the splitting, but I was thinking before that you may run into situations where you may have nesting, as in you may have a larger site with smaller sites and smaller nests within it. So you may need to think about, can things nest, and then also arrays of items where you have one site with multiple platforms and you know, a platform with multiple sensors. So it gets complicated with model representation because you've got nesting and arrays, but you may have to confront it.
Yeah,
but like for instance, we may have our Denman Glacier campaign area with particular research sites associated with it, with particular, you know, fixed camera locations. So just something to think about.
Did you raise your hand?
Well, so I agree. Also, we had the exactly same discussion when we set up the system for the cryonet stations within the WMO Cryosphere Watch. The sort of station versus network, or combination of stations, and then we had to scrap everything when we moved into WIGOS, also the Integrated Global Observing System, because definitions there were different. But you need some sort of mechanism to aggregate across these sort of small stations, and especially for glaciers, when you're observing on those, it's usually networks and not individual stations.
Ellen, please.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, if you're thinking about whether things are manned or not, you will also get stations that are manned for some of the years, but will then be kind of autonomous for the rest of that year. So it could get hard to kind of split those definitions, I think.
Yeah, that's very true. Our research station is manned for the summer, and then during the winter season, there's stations and stuff up, and it's checked on, but it's not manned.
Perhaps one could argue that outcomes raised or otherwise maybe simple and the shortest possible flexible definition is good, kind of along the lines of schema.org, rather than trying to add complexity for clarity, which ends up just kind of running into problems. That's what I'm hearing. Okay, yeah, there's like a lot to explore or consider. If we're ready, let's move on to this other question about governance, etc. So currently within ROPON, what we've been doing just a couple of times really is periodic ingest of a CSV into the ROPON database. And this is all working with the excellent team at Arctic Portal. They have done so well, I would say, and on a somewhat limited budget. So for this pilot project, right? And so we're exploring ideas to keep as a registry should, keep the content up to date, and ultimately, hopefully, have it be distributed with the networks or portals being responsible for maintaining that content. But it'd be helpful to get your all's thought about these things. I mean, obviously, we want to move away from just this rather skeleton framework that we have right now. But in a little bit, if there's time, we'll have you look at a suggested network form, Google form. That's one way. A lot of registries, they have essentially curators that add and edit content through an admin panel, and it requires then a lot of effort by this metadata curator, if you will, to reach out to networks and keep things up to date. We hope to have at some point, a network level login. And so actually a lot of registries use this, where say Dimes or Interact would have their own login, and they would be responsible for updating that content, maybe with some prompting through a GUI, right? Probably through a web-based form for editing and editing. And from the very beginning, there has been the suggestion that it be a truly automated or dynamic harvesting federated system where networks host schema.org like snippets on their servers, and there's either a push or a pull into the registry. What do you all recommend for governance, accuracy, scope of the registry, and how it'll operate in the future? I know there are a lot of proponents that really like, schema.org and federation through that. Is it really feasible to consider that networks would actually host schema.org network levels code snippets?
Yeah, that's
Furthermore,
Frank again.
Yes.
I mean, it depends what you're going for. If you keep a list like you have started at the moment, I mean, I don't see how much you would gain from. I mean, if not each of the links that you have, like has a basically at the moment you're just pointing to like here to the different networks like RMET or ConMap, and as long as you just keep like the one link to them in your database, I mean, it doesn't make sense to have, an extra schema.org in there, except maybe they want to have some information updated, but it's not changing so much. I mean, if you would point somewhere and they have a whole list of sublinks with information, then I think it would make sense to have something like schema.org. But at the moment, just adding one of new link at a time once in a while, I mean, that can be probably done like manually. And a good thing would probably be to have like some kind of cron job or tool in the background to just check if all the links still active or something has changed.
Yeah, very good, very good. Pretty simple records. Check for active links. We are hoping to, there's no schema.org thing for networks. You know, there's a profile for networks, not that I've seen, organization, observations. And so it would take a while to implement something, but we were hoping to have JSON LD embedded within these network level landing pages. We'll see what happens there. All right. If there's no other feedback on Ropon, we'll just move along right along. Any other feedback on Ropon, the registry? All right. I think it'd be helpful to touch a little bit more than on looking at the network level metadata model, which is underneath the structure of the registry. I'm going to put a link in the chat there. And let me just jump ahead a little bit here. Okay. Oh yeah. Let me show you that a little bit. So this has been released. It's really more of a data dictionary by POWIG. And you can view it in Google Sheets. And the idea being that there are all these different elements that describe a network or its scope or its spatial and temporal coverage and metadata, asset level metadata access. And this is what went into Ropon. And the fields in red we're considering to be mandatory for the registry. But we've included definitions and format, example entries, and then multiplicity, meaning whether or not it's a required element or not, and whether or not there can be multiple elements or entries within that element. We've done our best to try to keep it still fairly discovery level, but capturing what is necessary. And so you all can peruse that. But particularly with the expertise of this group, we had some things to bring up. And as an initial note, we've looked at other metadata models for observing networks, and there aren't really that many, and they're not very extensive. And then we also looked at some other data models and metadata models for related concepts that, different but related, such as organization, data repository, et cetera. But there really hasn't been anything comprehensive, I would say, released. So some of these decisions we had to make on our own, including, for example, about deciding on controlled vocabularies. And one of the thorniest ones was discipline. And branch of scientific knowledge or thematic focused for the observing network, right? And a lot of them have more than one discipline. And this, biology, cryosphere, data management, education, blah, blah, blah. We thought represented the best control vocabulary for discipline, drawing from, it was originally an IPY list, adopted by NSF. And it's similar but different from various other usually more extensive code lists or vocabularies for discipline. Any thoughts on that? Region, we wanted something really high order. Skip over that. Subregion, this is a tricky one. Because it's not a map-based interface, we wanted to have some guidance for what goes in to identify those networks that are, you know, focusing on Alaska or Greenland or the Canadian subarctic or the Ross Sea or whatever it is. And thoughts on this now or later?
Jonathan,
Appreciated.
I was going to say this, Jonathan, again. I can't speak to the specificity or applicability, but I think you might want to watch for creating custom vocabularies. I think geonames might cover some aspects, or what you would try to do is to get them to add it. But I would advise against creating a new vocabulary and then try to instead adapt existing vocabularies. Again, my recommendation would be geonames. I don't know if it meets your requirements, but I suspect that there's got to be something out there that would be capturing at least some of these names.
Okay, that's a good lead. I'm not sure we looked into that one specifically. Yeah, we'd rather avoid creating a custom vocabulary. All right. And okay, so in this observing asset world, quite a bit different actually than the data set interoperability world. These are the asset level metadata standards that we're aware of based on some what portals are using. And almost all of them are custom schema. But WMO WIGOS is an important one, of course. And ISO 19115 and its various flavors for projects and sites. Any other particular thoughts on that?
At least in terms of metadata for the Antarctic metadata directory, you'd want to take a look at diff. That's still in use.
For assets or for data?
Well, I was just thinking it's a metadata. We use it for all kinds of things.
And that's for the Antarctic, I'm sorry, which one?
Well, it's the standard format for the Antarctic metadata directory. So it's hosted by the former GCMD.
Yeah. Great. If there are asset level records in there shared by diff, that would be important to know.
Just to let you know, the Antarctic metadata directory used to be the Antarctic master directory, but we changed the name.
And hopefully all this is getting into the notes. That's good. And the more that we can get for the southern high latitudes, that also I think important. And again, adoption of metadata standards is like pretty far behind in this realm, I'd say. And maybe we could prompt Oystein to chime in here. So in terms of access protocols, either transfer protocols or web service formats, this is a list of what's currently enabled by a few catalogs, asset level catalogs, and then considering some more that might be applicable. Does this seem reasonable? Again, asset level, not data set level. And is it reasonable to clump them all together under asset access protocols? For example, with the mapping the polar data ecosystem, I think this was split into two different fields.
Stein, please.
So I think that in there you have a mix of different types of protocols. Some are used for discovery level metadata, which would be applicable in this context, and some are used for data. So I can't see why anyone should put out asset level metadata in OpenDAP, for example.
Okay.
So and for several of the other ones, so the API is a generic term, so it could mean anything, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some are generic terms and some are actually protocols in there.
Okay, very good.
And for file download, it would be HTTP or FTP or S3. You might have to break it out that way. And there may be some W3C lists that might help break it out a little bit better. Again, maybe you're fine on this one, but I would just say try and reuse existing vocabularies where they exist, and especially, the NERC vocabularies tend to be pretty good and they contain a lot of things. And if they don't have this, I'm sure that they'd want to probably discuss it.
Good. Very helpful feedback here. Oystein, in the notes, could you list which of these are data protocols that are not relevant for S level metadata that we should drop?
OData and OpenDAP at least won't be used for this purpose. For the other ones, WMS would be then a graphical representation of assets, but not the information in itself.
Understood.
So it's not everything I know in detail.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Any other feedback on the metadata model? All right. So how are you guys doing? Have you run out of steam? Can we go a little bit longer?
I think we can go for a few more minutes, Bill, if you want to just show the Google form. I don't know if we'll get to filling it out.
Maybe what would be best is if I show them the Google form and share that URL, and you all, if you want later, fill it in. Does that sound? So I am going to put this draft suggest a network form in the chat. And
You'll also need to,
I'm sorry?
You'll need it to display it on screen. You'll need to display it on screen, Bill, because there's quite a few people that aren't connected.
Yeah. Getting there. Good. So like we were saying, as a step towards something better, like some registries do, they have a form that suggests an entry. So we're considering the idea of adding this as a button on the registry, suggest a network. And so this is essentially a draft, and here we go into, first check that the network you wish to add is an observing network, or we'll change that discovery portal, that it encompasses or extends into the polar and subpolar regions. It doesn't include funding programs, and this follows the metadata model. We didn't make any of these things mandatory in the form, but the idea being that it, yeah. So we're just gonna move through this. The submitter's name, and a lot of this just falls straight from the metadata model, the network level information with definitions and examples. Some of these are multiple entries separated by type symbol. The link to a data repository for that network. Data repository. for that network, which is distinct from, well, what we'll see in a moment. Domains, disciplines, spatial coverage, subregion. We adopted for entry into the database the polygon spatial extent delineation from the Science on Schema.org recommendation for data sets. Polygon with some lats and longs and a string. Who knows whether or not that's really going to happen all that well without some sort of tool. And then information about observing assets with asset types identified for that network, with the link to definitions, whether or not that network or portal has an asset level metadata catalog. So this gets to another question that was raised. Should we include networks in ROPON that don't track assets like sites or projects? And so this is a way of including them that don't have actually an asset level catalog. And this is the direction we're going, I think. Yes.
I just wanted to point out to the group that at this point, none of the fields in this form are required, because we recognize that not everybody filling it out is going to have necessarily all of this information. But we're open to making certain fields required based on group feedback too.
And within the model, there are required fields for entry into ROPON. However, if this form is just used for this group informally, we didn't want to require any actually. And then the question is, if we put this on the ROPON website and that information harvested in a Google spreadsheet, then it will need to be curated, right? It'll need to be QC'd. And so the question is, in this Google form, do we actually require some things, the required elements to actually be required in the form? That's a question. So there's these other things here, and that's it. So, one thing I might point out is that the link to the data repository for the network is different than the link to the asset level metadata catalog, right? Yeah. SciOS, for example, has its own data catalog, and it also has a research infrastructure catalog. So that's it for the Google form. Feel free, for example, to add the Antarctic metadata directory if it has asset level records, or any other networks or discovery portals. And some of them, many of them are already on our radar, but it would be help to have people fill out this form so that we can prioritize what to add next. Any other thoughts for this workshop before we conclude a little early? In person or online?
Not seeing anything, Bill.
Well, thank you everyone for your input. Thanks to Bass and the organizers of the Polar Data Forum. Any business items for tomorrow?
I'd also like to thank Chantal Verhey for taking the notes today. to Jonathan and Jan Renee for helping me moderate.
Well, thank you all very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for remoting in. Much appreciated.
Very good. Take care.
Is that finished?
At this point, we'll close for today. This is actually the close of sort of our presentation type sessions. I realize that we may not have everybody in the room, but I do want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for attending the Polar Vessel Data Workshop and also these last 2 days. All that we have remaining tomorrow, there's an early meeting of the Arctic Data Interest Group. There is a SCADA meeting later on and then a joint group. So hopefully I'll see most of you there. But if we don't get the chance to see you there, thank you very much for your participation in Polar Data Forum 5. And while it's not over yet, again, thank you very much for all of your participation and interest. Well, hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.